Chapter 20. While the priest prepared to do some kind of magic on the werewolf before them, Andorn took a look at the sky and the moon and stars. Although he couldn't be sure, he was fairly confident that dawn was only a little way off. It had been a brilliant idea to smoke out the creature, even if it had required all the farm's hands to help put the worst of the fire out, and ultimately it had cost them the barn itself, but they weren't done yet. Twice now Andorn had seen the nearest werewolf limb twitch. It was beginning to come around, but it was injured, no doubt feeling the pain of not enough oxygen for a while, and all the other issues they had caused it. Whether the priest could influence it somehow remained to be seen, but he knew there was a good possibility. Somehow the priest had survived this long with Kiana. He hadn't been able to stop or control her so far, but equally, he wasn't dead, and that meant something must have aided him. If he thought he could replicate it and keep Kiana from killing other people, then Andorn was inclined to let him try. At first, no one had noticed Kiana's unconscious form in the tall plants. The priest had used a magical item to disguise her, and Mira had done a good job of keeping everyone away, but the werewolf was starting to stir, and Andorn didn't fancy his chances any longer. He had a hurried conversation with several more of the soldiers, informing them of the danger, but not where it was exactly. The soldiers had already begun to gather the farmers and send them all back to their houses or up to the main farmhouse to rest, recuperate, and stay away from the beast. One of the soldiers had volunteered to stay near the barn, just visible on the farmhouse side of it, no doubt keeping an eye on the fire from the safest place possible. The rest had been sent to help defend areas that were currently not in any danger. It would have to do. Andorn felt a little guilty that they'd burned down a barn and momentarily lied to everyone, but it was better than losing lives, and there was no other way they'd have been able to knock the creature out for so long themselves. As the werewolf stirred, Andorn gripped his rapier tighter, noticing the others preparing to fight as well. Thorgrim and Jarlen gripped their shields again. The priest remained near the werewolf, but not within striking distance, while the rest of the group formed a sort of ring, even farther out, again. No one moved as the werewolf version of Kiana growled and snarled and rolled into a crouch. It spotted Mira first and let out another aggressive snarl, but before it could attack, the priest stepped a little closer. The noise drew the beast's attention, and it roared at the priest. Andorn watched in surprise as the frail but steady-looking man stepped closer again and spoke in low, soothing tones. Bit by bit, the beast seemed to calm, although it still looked at the adventurers and bared its teeth regularly.
"Give me some space,"
the priest suddenly said, turning slightly sideways and glancing to the main gate out of the farmer's wheat field. Andorn moved towards Sarya, and Thorgrim shifted the other way. Slowly the priest sidled to the side, never looking away from the werewolf for long, although he didn't look directly at the creature either. At first, the werewolf merely made more noise, but eventually it stumbled after the priest. The pace continued to be slow, but the werewolf was mesmerized nonetheless, eyes fixed on the priest's face. They joined the road, Andorn and his companions all following on as quietly as they could, letting the priest both guide and seemingly soothe the monster and keeping it from attacking. Although Andorn had known something like this was possible in theory, it was a marvel to see and made him appreciate the differences in those around him a little more. The priest might not have had the battle skills that Thorgrim had, nor the ability to heal in the same way, but Thorgrim hadn't the skills that lent themselves to a task like this, and neither did Andorn in truth. Ulfr and Sarya hung back the most, their presence the greatest possible trigger for the werewolf, but not the only one. They were about half a mile down the road, the outpost apparently only the same distance again, when the priest caught his foot on a rock and faltered. Almost immediately, the werewolf shook her head as if to clear it, and then went to rush forward and decapitate the priest. But the priest didn't panic, merely muttering the words he'd said earlier again, and trying to charm the violent creature. It swayed, caught in indecision, and Andorn held up an arm to stop the others. This needed to work, or they would struggle to get Kiana safe before dawn. They were still out in the middle of nowhere, farms and people too close for Andorn to feel like he could let his guard down. The werewolf was fast, and there was still enough night left that it could cause havoc. Slowly, the werewolf calmed, and Andorn exhaled. The priest also slowly relaxed. A moment later, he shifted sideways again so he could shuffle along and lead the werewolf to the outpost. They only got another 50 meters when a deer jumped a nearby farm wall, however. The young buck had small antlers and was clearly this spring's young, but it was prey, and the werewolf fixed eyes on it right away. Howling, Kiana took off after the deer. The priest's charm was broken, and the creature almost knocked him over as it ran past, heading for the field the innocent animal ran into. "Keep up with her," Andorn yelled, sprinting after it as well. His companions didn't truly need telling, all of them running along after the werewolf, but they didn't even get close until the beast bounded right up to the deer, the prey unable to run anywhere near fast enough. Saria screwed up her nose and looked away as the werewolf bit the animal's head off and crunched the skull. Even Thorgrim pulled a face, and Mira stopped, her eyes going wide. Only Yarlin didn't react, continuing to watch as if the ferocious attack were something normal, or that he'd seen before. They waited and watched as the werewolf devoured the creature, huge bloody mouthful after huge bloody mouthful. Given the destruction and waste they'd found while trying to track down the werewolf, Andorn had expected it to waste loads of carcass now as well. But Kiana, or the werewolf she was cursed to be, must have been hungry. By the time the werewolf was done, there was nothing left but bloody patches of grass. Growling again, the werewolf finally took in its surroundings, including Andorn and his companions. They all prepared to fight again, gripping their weapons.
"I don't think I can charm her now," the priest said.
"How far to the outpost?" Andorn called, the werewolf spinning to fix on him.
"Down the road, maybe 1,000 meters. Less than half a mile, but not by much," the priest yelled back.
Kiana still seemed to ignore the man, even if he couldn't control her, so Andorn did the only thing he could think of doing in the circumstance, and ran for the road and then the outpost. Growling in an almost delighted fashion at having more prey to follow, the creature sprang after him, coming up fast, but Saria and Thorgrim got in its way at the gate to the road, tripping it between them before darting up and back into the shadows as far as they could. The werewolf growled at them, but Andorn wasn't going to give up. He picked up a stone from the side of the road and hurled it at the werewolf. It caught it on the side of the muzzle. "Come on," Andorn called. "Chase me. You know you want to eat me, not them." The taunt appeared to do the trick, Kiana rushing after him as he carried on running ahead. The companions and the priest all did their best to keep up, helping to slow the werewolf down now and then, but otherwise letting Andorn keep its focus and attention until they were near the fort and Andorn could see it looming up out of the darkness. "Now where?" Andorn called, but the priest had managed to put on some speed and appeared at his side.
"This way,"
the man called, not explaining where inside they were headed, but they weaved back and forth through a few small corridors until they came to a large set of double doors that stood empty in the depths of the outpost. Before Andorn could go inside, the priest grabbed his arm and yanked him back behind the open door instead. Hoping the beast was stupid enough to go in the room, Andorn held behind the door and tried to get his breath back. He had a stitch, and he had never run so hard in his life, but they weren't necessarily done. Looking for the priest to ask if the door had a bar or a key or something, Andorn noticed the man hadn't hidden with him or on the other side, but still stood out in the open. As the werewolf came barreling forward, the priest ran inside the room. Before Andorn could do more than come out from behind the door, the werewolf was inside. The priest stood there with his hands up in front of his chest, palms forward. Andorn expected him to get his head torn off, but the werewolf slowed again and snarled, only a few centimeters from him. The priest slowly moved around the creature, their eyes locked together.
I know you're hungry, Kiana, and angry, but you're safe now, and we'll get you more food,
he said, his voice gentle. Andorn didn't dare breathe, but made sure his body was back and out of view, now only able to see the priest as the priest backed up towards the door. Yarlin appeared on the other side, having enough presence of mind to stop. Andorn held up his hand to stop the others as they also came running down the corridor, weapons drawn. Then he put his finger to his lips and his other hand on the edge of the door, ready to push it shut. Thorgrim prepared to do the same to the other of the double doors, but the werewolf must have sensed something was wrong, and this was a trap as the priest reached the door. The priest came running out, and the creature would have followed if Mira hadn't stepped forward and blasted around the priest with a rush of ice and cold air. It seemed to slow the beast again, making it yelp. With a little more time, Andorn and Thorgrim slammed the doors shut. They braced them as Kiana recovered and hurled herself against the doors. "How do we close this and keep it that way?" Andorn demanded, the doors shaking between them as the werewolf scrabbled at the solid oak and tried to push its way out. Despite their weight and strength, the door opened a fraction, and Saria had to smack her sword down onto the clawed arm as it tried to reach through and take hold of one door. It let out another yowl of rage and pain, but the attack forced it back. A moment later, Mira and Yarlin appeared with a large dining bench and shoved it across the doors. It helped, but Thorgrim and Andorn still had to brace the doors while Saria stood ready, and Mira, Yarlin, and the priest ran off to get even more heavy furniture. By the time there was a second bench, a large wardrobe-like piece of furniture, and some chairs they could wedge across the hall at an angle, the beast was going nowhere. For the first time since sunset, Andorn relaxed. Despite the werewolf scrabbling to get out and trying to claw at the door, exhaustion took over, and Andorn sank to a sitting position against the far wall. Slowly, the rest of them all sat down as well. No one spoke for a while, everyone looking at the door as it shook and shuddered, holding up for now. The pounding grew less as the creature realized it couldn't get out of the room any other way. There was an almighty crash of furniture being flung around. Something sounded like it shattered, and an angry roar before nothing but silence. The priest winced, and Andorn wondered how much it was going to cost to repair all the damage Kiana had done. Possibly most of the reward they had been offered for finding both the priest and Kiana alive. It would need to be offered, however. It was his fault the barn had been burnt down, and now the soldiers' outpost was being torn apart. As they sat there, Saria reached for her knapsack and pulled out a loaf of bread she had wrapped up. He recognized it as another of the batch the cook must have made at the inn the previous morning. It was a bit battered and had crumbled a bit, but she tore chunks off and passed them out. Everyone munched, the sustenance more than welcome after spending so long fighting. While they sat there, the corridor slowly grew lighter, and their faces more distinct, no longer just lit by the small lamp that had been burning at one end. Before long, there were some more noises from the blocked-off room, but they sounded like the moans and weeps of a woman.
"I think it's safe to remove the barrier,"
the priest said, getting to his feet.
"You have my extreme gratitude, and no doubt you will have Kiana's once she has recovered from her ordeal."
It took a moment, Andorn's and no doubt everyone else's bodies stiff from the exertion and subsequent rest, but they stood up and started to pull away the furniture, piece by piece, Yarlin and Thorgrim taking it back where they'd found it. With nothing barring the doors, Mira reached into her pack and pulled out a spare tunic and set of trousers, and then they opened a door, just enough for the women to check Kiana was back in human form, and for Saria and Mira to slip inside. Saria came out first, a tired smile on her face, her body moving slowly, as if her limbs were heavier than normal. Not long later, Mira came out with Kiana tucked under her arm. Kiana's eyes were puffy, and she barely dared look at anyone, but she was herself again. "Come, we've all had a long night, but we're all safe now," "Let us return to the inn and rest." Andorn slowly led the way, once more proud of the group of companions he could call friends. Their solution to the problem might not have been perfect, but everyone was alive. And other than Mira's quarterstaff, a barn, and what looked like a couple of beds in the soldiers' outpost, they hadn't lost anything to the beast. They would need to find a cure for Kiana still, but they had several weeks to do so now instead of only a few hours. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. They were only part way back to town when Mira suddenly stopped. "This is where the carriage came off the road, right?" she asked. Andor nodded.
"I don't think it's worth rescuing," the priest said. "Repairing it would cost me more than I have."
"Would you mind letting us have it?" Mira asked. "I know of a use for it." The priest nodded immediately, and Mira grinned her usual broad smile. Andor knew exactly what she wanted it for. The thought of the misunderstood fireball they had waiting for them at the guild coming into his mind. Another problem they needed to solve. The tall carriage might give their dangerous companion a way to travel if they could enchant it and reinforce certain sections. Andor found himself smiling at the possibility, although all of them opted to come back for the carriage later. They needed rest, and it wasn't going anywhere.